This is the Federal Mobility Policy Update with Beth Osborne from Transportation for America, Martha Roskowski from the Mobility and Access Collaborative, and Darryl Young from the Summit Foundation. This week, the Senate passed a $1 trillion infrastructure bill and then went on vacation until September, leaving a larger $3.5 trillion measure to languish. House leadership has said that they won't move on the Senate infrastructure measure until the Senate passes the larger measure as well. Where does that leave funding for walking, biking, transit, and EVs? Does it mean more money for climate-destroying roads? Does it give more power to Pete Buittgig to determine where the money goes? Will the House rubber stamp the Senate's actions? And what can be done to fix it in the House? All that and more on this week's edition of the Federal Mobility Policy Update. Welcome to another edition of the Federal Mobility Policy Update. This week, a special edition talking about specifically what did the Senate pass beyond a $1 trillion infrastructure bill. What does that mean? And they've gone on vacation, leaving a larger $3.5 trillion measure to languish. Now, the House has said that they won't move on the Senate infrastructure measure until the Senate passes the larger measure as well. So we're going to unpack what all of that means, both within the Beltway, but also where you live. With us is Beth Osborne from Transportation for America. Hi, Beth. And Martha Roskowski from the Mobility and Access Collaborative. Hi, Martha. And I'm Darryl Young from the Summit Foundation. Let's start by looking at winners and losers. Normally we say, what are the three quick hits? I think it's more important. It's how you define winners and losers. But Beth, who were the winners and losers this last week?
Sure. The winners are, those who believe claiming a bipartisan win will be good for them politically. The White House strongly believes that. The Senate clearly strongly believes it. And those who needed the bipartisan package to go through to have a chance at reconciliation. The White House firmly has believed that they needed to really give up whatever they needed to in the infrastructure package in order to protect the much larger ask that they had coming in reconciliation, which includes a large number of non-infrastructure issues, including healthcare and things like that. I would say that those status quo interests who have always benefited from transportation infrastructure bills, so the state DOTs, the road builders, there will be a lot of jobs created by this. You can create jobs with good spending and bad spending. So there's going to be a lot of opportunity for construction workers, for lawyers who will be buying up land for new infrastructure, for engineers. There will be a lot of new jobs created because no matter how you're spending the infrastructure dollars, whether we consider it to be good or bad, it creates a lot of jobs. So there will be many construction jobs, engineering jobs, planning jobs, lawyering jobs for all the work that's going to come in gathering up land for new projects and protecting the DOTs from lawsuits and things like that. The losers are those who are worried about outcomes like public health, local economic development, racial equity, and climate, because this bill is not oriented towards those outcomes. And so, and there won't be any way to negotiate, with any supreme being to say, for example, on climate, we had to cut this deal to get it through. And, because we did the best we could, you should ignore the increase in carbon. This is not the last battle. There will be opportunities to advocate for better implementation of these programs, but it does set us up, at a deficit. It's going to be hard to climb out of the hole and work with the 55 DOTs to make sure they spend this money in a way that might not be close to their traditional way of spending in order to get the outcomes that we care for.
Interesting. So what won out was political expediency, politics over policy so far.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right.
Certainly
I also think that there's just still a lack of understanding, particularly in the statewide elected set of the impacts of these investments on the outcomes that we're talking about.
Yeah, so when we last talked last week, there was a bill moving forward. Were there amendments made to it? Did it improve at all before the final was passed?
There were over 200 amendments offered or introduced at least, but I believe they only ended up considering about 40. So it was a really frustrating thing to see that the amendment process was clearly not a serious discussion for the so-called deliberative body to really think through the bill. It was a process that gave people a sense that they might have a role in shaping the bill. In some ways, it kept them occupied before we found out it was too late. And I think there's an understanding that even those in the Senate that claimed that these things that they were seeking were important, for the most part, particularly on the Democratic side, wasn't that important to them at all. They were going to vote for the bill regardless.
Yeah, it seemed like there was so much momentum and there's so much celebration about the bill being passed and the fact that 19 Republicans voted for it, that it really has overshadowed any conversation about what did we actually buy. I'm
not sure we ever had that conversation, frankly. And the negotiations weren't really about what we were buying either. When it came to talking about safety and setting targets for safety that would, target more fatalities, the discussion on the Hill was, well, don't we need to give states more flexibility? And no one said, you mean flexibility to have more people die? We're going to give them hundreds of billions of dollars because they need, and then let them have the flexibility to plan for more people to die on their roadways. That's a level of substance that seems to be missing in the Senate.
Well, and that seems to be the spin, is that look at all this extra money we're spending for walking, biking, and transit, but with what direction, for what purpose, and also for roads, new roads that don't necessarily have to consider the climate impacts of those decisions or the safety impacts of those decisions. Unpack a little bit about the additional money, because certain advocates for walking, biking, and even transit are heralding that extra money. That could be good, but it's not good if you have to compete with roads that are making things worse for those modes.
The tradition in this bill, going back since before I started working in Washington, D.C., is everybody gets more. You make the pie bigger, and you may reorganize how big everybody slices a little bit, but for the most part, everybody gets more, and that makes everybody feel like a winner. But it's produced really the same outcomes repeatedly because it hasn't changed the structure of the program to orient it towards particular goals. So, on safety, particularly for vulnerable users, there is significantly more money in this bill, not just for vulnerable users, but for a Vision Zero approach. They have a specific Vision Zero program. And all of that sounds really good. But people don't then back up and say, so the whole highway program is separate from Vision Zero? Mm-hmm. How do you accomplish Vision Zero if, I don't even know what the percentage is, but I think it's 11 billion for Vision Zero, and then something like 300 billion for not Vision Zero roads. So I guess if you're doing just the math on that, it means you have something like 289 billion for non-Vision Zero. I don't see the win there.
Right.
But it's simpler to say, look at this little pile of funding that says something good on it, not even to get into the fact that that money can be flexed out in many cases into non-safety purposes, particularly when it comes to the highway safety program, because we allow states to set targets for fatalities that go up. And as long as they meet their higher fatality rate or higher fatality target, they're allowed to use safety dollars for non-safety purposes.
Yeah, and I'm particularly concerned about, as Beth says, the continuing to make widening roads really easy. Like it's 5 times easier to widen a road than it is to build a bike path in terms of process, in terms of everything. And
now, for the record, that is not actually the case legally. That is the result of giving states flexibility.
yes.
It's how the states use their flexibility. They take advantage of absolutely every piece of flexibility in the law to expand their roadway, the actual priority. And then they impose very difficult restrictions that no one makes them impose, certainly not the federal government, to go after those projects that they're upset that they have to do.
Yes. And the history of highway widening projects, when you look at them, is that every single highway widening project has basically, you add 1% of capacity, you increase VMT by 1%. So every time we widen a road, we're undoing all of the hard work that advocates and others have been doing to build better bike lanes, to improve transit, to do all of it. That's what frustrates me, with the excitement over more money for bike lanes, is that if you're at the same time making it easier to drive at every step of the way, you're really undermining the progress that you've made. So,
well, and Martha, if you think back to the early 1990s with Ice-T, there was, a program dedicated to walking and biking for the first time, the Transportation Enhancements Program. It was increased to unprecedented levels in T21, and again in Safety Lou. I ask, did that transform things? Did that change the balance of safety for bicyclists and pedestrians? And I would argue not only no, but if you look at Dangerous by Design, we've done worse. So how can we say having a dedicated program with the right name on it as a tiny subset of the overall spending gets us the outcomes we are seeking?
Right. So
and I get that people feel like this is the most we can ask for, but if we self-edit, if we ask for less than we need, we certainly can't get what we do.
Right. It's a Pyrrhic victory. Yeah, I hear you on that. And so it feels like it tastes great, but it's a lot less filling. And like most light beer, it doesn't get you where you need to go. Another example that I thought was really telling was the reconnecting communities element, which is trying to take down freeways that were inherently racist and dislocated communities. It went from initial, $21 billion, and now it's $1 billion, which doesn't really buy you anything. So I
think that there was some additions in the back, and so it's a little bit higher than that. And, this is the first time we've ever done anything like this.
Right.
I will also point out, and I know we're going to move into implementation and things like that, the DOT will be sitting on an unprecedented amount of funding that they control. They could dedicate some of that further to this purpose. But yes, you're right. It was an ambitious start that went pretty small.
Beth, let's dive a little deeper into that. This bill does give money and perhaps power to Pete Buittgig and the US DOT. So they could potentially put more guardrails on some of that money. But are we talking about like a white painted bike lane, or are we talking about, a really good protected bike lane in terms of, trying to direct that money?
Yeah, I mean, again, as we just talked about, saying that there's an unprecedented amount of money for something doesn't necessarily mean it's enough to really change the outcomes of the program. So yes, I believe there's something like 12 or 15 different competitive grant programs for all number of things. From they've authorized what we started out calling the Tiger program, and then called Build, and now we call Raise. Which means it's grounded. It's not just a appropriations add-on anymore. That's positive. And all kinds of other opportunities to steer money, including to culverts and very specific things like that. They also have a freight program, of which I believe 70% must go to highways. States have to go plan all of their freight priorities. And then for the most part, we're not going to look at what your priorities are, only the highway ones. But there's a great opportunity to steer that funding towards these outcomes. Now, it's still the minority of funding. So it's important to remember that while DOT can control the money under their control, they can't touch the money, the majority, still large majority of funding that's in someone else's control. Now, there are things that we can start talking about regulatorily in terms of their guidance, in terms of what they do with their bully pulpit to steer that money as well. But yeah, I think it's more of, painted bike lanes, maybe some, what do you call them? You call them what?
Plastic
Arrows.
Yeah.
No, maybe some, maybe even beyond that, maybe some like temporary delineators,
Right.
things like that to put on there. But they have set themselves back. They have said, hey, we're going to be great implementers of this program so long as we're in control. And they have set themselves up for an extremely heavy lift because of how far back they're set by an inadequate law. So, the same administration that couldn't get rid of, negative targets for safety is now saying that's all right. We will lift tons and tons in order to perfect this bill. Not saying they can't. There's incredible talent there, but it's going to be way harder than just negotiating some smarter things in this bill.
So
it again pushes a lot of the burden down to this advocates at a state and local level to try to bend, affect how the state DOTs choose to spend the money.
right. And let's remind ourselves, this is only the first house. It remains to be seen what Nancy Pelosi and our leaders like Peter DeFazio do in the House. Do you, particularly with the reconciliation measure, do you think that the House will rubber stamp the Senate's actions? What do you think they'll do? What is the opportunity for the House to change this?
First off, Peter DeFazio has been beyond amazing. And it's not just that he and his extraordinarily talented staff wrote a very well thought out bill that connects within all of the different provisions, of a 1,250 page bill. It was really tightly, smartly written. But he has also continued to be a champion for the language that was in there. Peter DeFazio knows everything that is in his bill, can explain it to you and tell you not just why he wants it there or why it's important, but why anything else is irresponsible. What he has done is nothing less than extraordinary, and we need to remember that. Now, he has been fighting really hard to give the House a role in this bill, and the White House has absolutely cut them off at the knees. And as wonderful as Peter DeFazio is, he probably cannot fight back the power of the Senate, the White House, and the pressure that will be put on his leadership. So my guess is most of the play will be on a reconciliation bill. And the question is whether or not they can improve any of this through reconciliation. They cannot touch policy. So policy changes can't be made in reconciliation. Only funding changes can be made in reconciliation. Then there's the question of whether or not doing anything on transportation will be considered double dipping. And the question is by the Senate, and the question is by the senators who are the most likely to not support reconciliation if they feel anything is amiss. So the question that we have now is, to what extent are those in the Senate that are a little squeamish about supporting reconciliation, how far are they willing to go to put a little more funding into various infrastructure pots? I think we have a claim that, the original bipartisan infrastructure framework that was announced with great fanfare by both parties and the White House actually had a different agreement than the one they finally reached. The one they reached this agreement, and then they said all we have to do is write the language. But as they wrote the language, they cut transit by 10 billion. So they didn't respect the bipartisan framework. So maybe there's an opening there especially for those senators who are, trying to adhere to this deal, to say it's not a problem to go back to the original agreement, because the fact that we passed something that didn't adhere to it was a violation of that agreement. There are things like that we can do. There might be an opportunity as we do, to include some money specifically for transit operating. There's a specific amount of funding in the budget bill for climate. We don't know what that means. Is there something there that can be used to plus up the EV recharging funds without having to spend money on propane stations and natural gas stations? So we have opportunities when it comes to money. We do not have opportunities remaining as it pertains to policy.
In the reconciliation bill, right?
Well, they're all being wrapped together.
Okay.
So Nancy Pelosi's position is, she's trying to make sure that the rest of the agenda is taken care of at all. That is a big lift. And so the only reason she's able to keep that part alive is on the notion that they're not touching the infrastructure package. And it might be just too much to take on, saving the $2.5 trillion worth of spending priorities and fiddling with the $1 trillion of infrastructure policy changes.
So for our funder audience, for our advocate audience, what can we do in terms of talking to members of Congress, raising this? Clearly, the focus has to turn to the state level and the local level to try to direct those monies as much as possible. And
the administration.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So is that where we all turn our focus? Do we just write off the House and not worry
quite
about
yet.
it? Not quite. Okay.
Yet. I think the focus for the next, so the House is planning to come back into session on August 23rd. And that's when they will take up the budget and write a reconciliation package that goes back to the Senate. And with that getting passed, the House will then take up and pass the infrastructure package. That's how Nancy Pelosi knows that that she gets everything she needs. She holds the infrastructure package hostage, and which I think, by the way, is very good strategy and very smart on her part. It will. I think we need to focus for this time period on reminding everyone that the Senate violated their own agreement. It's not like it was a quiet agreement. It's not like it was a rumored agreement. There were fact sheets put out. There were articles written. There was praise given on all sides. And then they said, we just have to write the details. Well, the numbers weren't the details. That was the skeleton, and they violated that skeleton.
They changed it.
So let's say the House shouldn't have to agree to this whole thing without going back to the original agreement and get that 10 billion back for transit. That will put us in a much better space, just in terms of funding the amount of transit we need. And then we should start pivoting, and folks like me and my organization need to start going through the bill to see where there are authorities that USDOT can take advantage of to make sure the money is spent in the best way possible. And then bring that to the advocates so that they can start pushing, not just within USDOT, but within their own states, to make sure they're implementing it in the best way possible. And I think one of the biggest things we need to think about going forward is how to connect projects announced, priority setting that happens after the bill is made, particularly those that do not match up with the promises that we have been given by those that voted for this bill, particularly in the Senate and in the White House, and bring it back to them and make them feel uncomfortable for the things that we can predict, but they seem incapable of, and say, you promised this would be good for the climate. How do you explain Project X? which only is getting done because of your bill, or you said this was going to be good for equity. How do you explain this project that would never have gotten done but for this bill that is going to harm this minority neighborhood in this community? Because the more they feel discomfort for this vote in the near future, over the next year, the more that will be in their brains the next time they have to vote for this. And that is something that we've never made Congress feel before. It's why when the bill comes back up after 5 years, they don't know that there were bad outcomes because they're left out. And I think we need to make them feel included in the challenges that they've created.
So accountability for the actions in real world terms on the ground in your neighborhood or around your block is the way to ensure that representative democracy is truly representative of the good things and representative of the bad things.
Absolutely.
Yeah, it's just too bad that we have to do it about bad things being built.
Right.
Right. You know, I would love to see the administration move forward with performance measures around greenhouse gas emissions, around safety, and make that a part of project selection. At least have to quantify what is your highway widening going to do for climate.
They can do this. They can require induced demand to be measured and give people guidance on how to measure induced demand.
Let's do that.
Require people to account for how good their models are, and when they're off, require them to update them or not accept their modeling if it's repeatedly off by a certain amount. They can say we will not give competitive grant awards to states that set negative safety targets. There's a number of things they can do.
Yes.
Right. So it's the to-do list for the next 4 years, the next 3 years. And as this infrastructure measure will have repercussions for at least the next 5 years, probably likely the next 10 years. Accountability beyond the headlines of we spent this much money. What did it actually get? What did we get for that is the most, I think, important thing. We unfortunately have to close this out. I want to thank Beth for putting up with the audio constraints. If you've heard some grinding in the background, it's because Beth's next door neighbor is doing some construction. It's not because Beth has or any of us have stomach problems. But it
wasn't my jaw. I wasn't grinding my teeth out.
That's right. That's right. Let's close out as we always do with a somewhat interesting question. We're in the summer. We're about to enter in the last phase of the summer. What is your song of the summer? So let's start with Beth.
So I have a really nerdy answer to this. So I went to Maine for the first time, and for the 2 weeks leading up to my vacation, the 2 weeks I was up there and the week returning, I couldn't get the carousel waltz from the Rodgers and Hammerstein musical Carousel out of my head. And so that probably tells you a lot about me, that I go straight to Broadway.
We'll put the YouTube link in the show notes for that if you'd like to have that invade your dreams as well. Martha, what is your song of the summer?
You know, I just went to a lovely music festival, the Folks Festival up in Lyons, Colorado, up the road from where I live. And a singer-songwriter named Gregory Alan Isaacoff he is fabulous. And he has a song called San Luis that it keeps running through my head. Highly recommended. He has a great video, San Luis Valley, you know, the sand dunes and the sandhill cranes. And it's really beautiful. So a little taste of Colorado for you.
So we'll put that in the list. My song is September by Earth, Wind and Fire. I had a friend by the name of Jay Gavin who would play it endlessly when he was working over the summer. And then one time I went to a Shakey's Pizza and programmed the jukebox to play it like 100 times. So September by Earth, Wind and Fire as we enter into September. So we're going to have to leave it at that. I want to thank Beth Osborne from Transportation for America for joining us. I also want to thank my colleague Martha Roskowski from the Mobility and Access Collaborative. We'll be back soon with more information of the travails of both the bipartisan infrastructure measure as well as the reconciliation measure. Have yourself a good summer, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.